As many of you know, I used to struggle with very, very deep and relatively extreme levels of anxiety and stress in my body. And when I really felt it the most, or the times that stand out the most to me of those times when I have anxiety, and believe me, it's hard to even remember how it felt. I mean, I want you to know that there is an answer to your anxiety, right? There is a life beyond your anxiety. And I'm here to tell you that life is attainable. Okay, because again, I can hardly remember some of it's hard for me to recall the times and the details of how I used to feel when I was wrapped up in this anxiety and the stress. Where I do remember it, or where I kind of can, see it in my memory, in my past, is in the interactions that I had with people, right? Like, the sort of conflicts and the sort of interpersonal stress that would go on, right? But the other place that I really, the thing that stands out the most for me in terms of that anxiety period of my life, is when I'd wake up in the morning. And what I mean by that is really, really specific, right? That I remember that in the morning, there would be this time, right? There would be, I want to say it was like a couple of minutes, but it might have only been like 30 seconds, right? Maybe even only 10 seconds for all I can't remember, right? But there was this brief window of time in which I just felt okay. Like there was nothing running through my mind. There was nothing that was, there was no sense of worry. There was no sense of impending doom. There was no sense of, oh gosh, what's gonna happen today? As I say, it was a very brief period of time in which that thoughtless, sort of waking up happened. And then all of a sudden there'd be like, it would start with one thought, right? It starts with, something about work, right? And then the next thought is something about like, oh, well, what about this social thing in my life? Or what about this romantic thing? And then another work thing, and then a financial thing. And then what about my health? And then, all kinds of like, do I have the groceries? Do I have to, all the stuff starts just flowing and rushing through the mind. And then before I know it, in a window that's just as short as that window of no thoughts, that quickly, my thoughts are just completely overwhelming me. Getting me into a state of, true dread, as they call it, morning dread, right? It's a very common thing that we all deal with, people who experience anxiety or people who are prone to anxiety. Almost all of us deal with this. Now, here's the thing that I find really interesting about this, and especially as I, look at it from the vantage point of having healed from some of this stuff and no longer experiencing morning dread. I have none of it, ever, not at all. But the thing that really is fascinating to me is that, nothing happened in that period of time, right? Between the time that I woke up with no thoughts in my mind and the time, a minute or two later when the thoughts were just rushing through my mind uncontrollably and chaotically and just overwhelmingly, nothing happened. It wasn't like somebody kicked down my door. It wasn't like the phone rang with some really, stressful news. It wasn't like, I woke up and realized the house was on fire or something like that. It was all in here. It was just one thought leading to another, leading to another, leading to another. And it kind of creates its own energy in that way. Now that's the thing to really understand about what morning dread, how it works and what it really does to us, you see. Because you see, what happens is when we have those thoughts, right? When we think like, oh, this work project, or oh, this, the way my girlfriend said something last night, or my friend, I'm supposed to go to his birthday party and I don't want to go, or something like that, right? Like, when we have those thoughts, right? There's a part of our brain, a very deep, reactive and not very, sort of executively functioning or proactive or logical part of our brain, but the very reactive part of our brain, it senses those thoughts. And to that part of the brain, these are not just thoughts that I'm having while I'm lying here safely in my bed, waking up on a Tuesday morning, right? To that part of my brain, these thoughts mean this is happening right now. So in other words, my brain thinks, even though I'm just lying there in bed, in the span of 2 minutes, my girlfriend has broken up with me, my friend hates me, and my whole career is going down the tubes, right? That part of my brain thinks that is all happening right here, right now. Now, that's all well and good, right? Good for that part of my brain, right? But here's the problem. Or here's where the real challenge and the real dilemma arises in this morning dread, in the context of this morning dread. Because you see, that part of my brain, it only knows how to handle that danger in one singular and very specific way. And it's the only thing it can ever do. And what it does is it triggers another part of my brain that sets in motion what is called the HPA axis response, right? I don't want to get too technical, but basically what we're talking about is the stress response. And what I mean by stress response is I mean the release in my body of stress hormones. Stress hormones being cortisol and adrenaline and norepinephrine. Now, again, this HPA axis is the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the adrenal gland, right? They just, in a very quick succession, they pick up that signal from the part of my brain that thinks that, like my boss is firing me even as we speak, right? And it signals that whole, it triggers that process that results in the release of stress hormones. Now, why is that an issue? Right? That is an issue because, as we know through very clear and uncontroversial neuroscientific research, that the way that our body feels in any given moment is sort of the governor of what thoughts are going to arise in our mind. Which is to say that if we're feeling, say, pleasure, right? Like, let's say we wake up and we have a great breakfast, we're not working that day or whatever, or maybe it's not when we wake up because we still have that morning dread. So let's say at any given point during the day, like let's say we go out to lunch with a really close and really loved friend. And during that time, we have this great conversation and we're having this delicious meal and we're just really enjoying our time. We're feeling connected. We're feeling safe with each other. We're feeling like this is beautiful, right? There's no sign of any stress hormones right now, right? There's nothing wrong. There's nothing in my brain that says anything is wrong. And so therefore, the thoughts that are going to arise are generally going to be pretty positive. And when I say positive, what I really mean is optimistic. Right? The thoughts that arise, and it really has to do with where the brain is in that moment, but we won't get too technical. But I can get into that in another video. But when those thoughts arise, right, or the thoughts that do arise in that pleasant and happy state are going to be like everything's going to be all right. I can handle this. Like whatever arises, I'm going to be able to handle it. Right? Because we're feeling, it's the feeling in our body that informs the brain that everything is okay right now. And if everything's okay right now, then I don't feel worried. I don't feel panic. I don't feel stress. I don't feel anxiety. Now that brings us back to the cortisol and the adrenaline, okay? Cortisol and adrenaline do one very specific thing to your body. Revs everything up. Okay, it puts you into, a lot of people call it the fight or flight response. It's not really technically that, but it's good enough to talk about, right? What it really is the sympathetic nervous system response. The sympathetic nervous system is like, we could call it the accelerator of our system. Right, our whole body, it's the accelerator, right? When we're in that sympathetic nervous system response, it's like we're revved up. It's like a car with the RPMs up, almost at the red line, right? And when our body is in that condition, it doesn't matter what is happening around us. It doesn't matter what we see, what we hear, what we, smell or taste or touch. In that condition of our body, all revved up, we are in a state of survival mode. We're in a state of trying to protect ourselves. And so therefore, that feeling of the body, and this is by design, this is not like some flaw in the system, right? That in that state of my body, my thoughts are going to become pessimistic. My thoughts are going to become, what's the worst thing that could possibly happen right now? Or even more specifically, I'm sure that the worst possible thing that could happen right now is the thing that is going to happen right now, and there's no question in my mind. And that there, the part of your brain that can tell you that, well, wait a second, we don't know that to be true. Maybe something else might happen. Maybe you could, things will work out. Maybe there's an answer to this problem that we're just not seeing. That part of your brain that can come up with those, sort of countermeasures, it's offline. You cannot connect to it in that moment of the cortisol and the adrenaline and the sympathetic nervous system response. You literally cannot do it. I mean, think about it, right? You're if you're in a state of danger, you don't want your brain thinking, oh, well, maybe everything will be okay. Well, it's just a lion. He's not going to really hurt. He doesn't look that hungry, right? So this is a necessary part of our system. But when we experience anxiety, right, it becomes like the system becomes perverted, right? It becomes like way overused. It becomes like it's out of balance, right? Again, it's like revving your car up as high as it can go and thinking you could just drive. Eventually it breaks, right? And that's what we're doing to our body in that morning dread. And of course, throughout the day, right? Because the morning dread turns into, the commute dread. And the commute dread turns into the breakfast dread. And the breakfast dread turns into the meeting dread and the email dread and the lunch dread and the payroll dread and all the dreads. And all that time, that cortisol and that adrenaline keeps our mind and our perspective in that negative space, and that pessimistic space, that what's the worst thing that could possibly happen, and that's definitely the thing that's going to happen right now. And so that becomes all day. And then what happens at night? Right? Well, usually, for me, it was drinking. It was having enough alcohol that stuff just kind of stopped. It just kind of quieted for a little while. And then I finally go to sleep, and then what happens? In the morning, the cycle starts again, right? There we are again. Same thing, like Groundhog Day, am I right? And I know some of you know this, right? I know that you are with me on this, because everyone who experiences anxiety, which is a huge portion of our society, everyone who experiences anxiety experiences some form of morning dread. And that morning dread for none of us is contained to just the morning. So I've told you all the bad news here, right? I've told you all the problems here. What's the solution? And as I've told you, as I started this video, there is a solution. You do not have to live in this state day in and day out and just medicating yourself, and of course it's not all of you are using alcohol to sort of dissolve this in your mind. Some of you might be working out, some of you might be using a sex addiction or a pornography addiction or video game addiction or some sort of narcotics of some kind. Now, they call these things maladaptive coping mechanisms. Cigarettes, alcohol, cannabis, narcotics, even overdoing gym, workouts, and overdoing sex, and overdoing pornography, and overdoing video games, and all that stuff, even just TV, whatever it is, eating, overeating and all that stuff, right? These are all called maladaptive coping mechanisms. What does that mean, right? It means that, yes, they are adaptive in a sense, like they do the thing that we want them to do. They quiet down that whole, anxious tornado of thoughts that's going on in our mind. But they do so at the expense of our physical health. They do so at the expense of our physical health. So now let's get back to the solution, right? Okay, Art, you told me all the horrible stuff, so now what do I do with this, right? So the idea here, or the solution, lies in the ability to tell our brain, to reassure our brain, to remind our brain even that it's not as dreadful and dangerous as our brain thinks it is in that moment. Right? Which is just on a very simple, sort of level, it's about reminding our brain that, hey, we're just lying in bed here. And everything right here, right now is okay. Now, here's a very basic concept about, and this is Captain Obvious stuff, and I'm sure all of you that deal with anxiety already understand this, but maybe some of you don't, so I'm going to say it anyway, even though it feels obvious. Anxiety is all about thinking about the outcomes. It's all about thinking what's going to happen, right? But our brain and our nervous system react on are designed to respond and react to what is happening, not what's going to happen, but what is happening. And so in a very real way, the answer, at least the beginning of the answer, the very first step of this is to get our brain, or get, that part of our brain that feels like everything's just, disaster around us, get that part of the brain to realize that no, you're thinking of the future. But what is really happening right here, right now, I'm lying in my bed. I've got 20 minutes to go before I have to, get in the shower and get ready for work or whatever, or maybe I'm late, but yeah, I'm just late for work. It's not anything other than just being a little late for work, right? Being late for work is not really connected to my bank account or what my girlfriend said last night, or, or what my health issues are. Of course there are some connections to that stuff, but the point is that there's not like a cause and effect that's like an immediate emerging thing that's happening. What is really happening is I'm just in my bed thinking. And that's what the key is, right? And this is where people, it's almost like, I feel like it's almost too simple, right? But it really comes down to a single word, which is attention. Where is my attention right here, right now? For example, is my attention on the fact that I am just lying in bed, that my body is just waking up, and that I'm, safe, and that I'm, just kind of, again, I have 20 minutes to get ready for work or whatever, and I'm just gonna go have breakfast and go on with my day, right? Is that where my attention is? Or is my attention on all that stuff that might happen? And here's another thing that's really important to understand that I hope lends a little bit of consolation for all of you anxiety sufferers like me. There is a part of the part of the system in the brain, right, that is designed to think of the worst stuff, right? It's actually called the default mode network. And it happens when we are in a non-task oriented activity, like waking up in the morning. Right? So in other words, when you don't have something that you're focused on, and it's not just waking up in the morning, right? Like, we don't need to focus on making coffee. We don't need to focus on pouring a bowl of cereal. We don't have to focus on driving our car. We don't have to focus on showering, on getting dressed, on going to the bathroom, on driving, even getting on the train, getting on the bus. We don't have to think about any of this stuff, right? It does not require our attention to put our shoes on. You put your shoes on so many times, or brush your teeth, right? I remember when my daughter was 10 years old and she would say, I don't know how to brush my teeth. I don't want to. It's like, you brush your teeth 3,600 times already in your life. You certainly do know how to do it, right? So you absolutely do not have to think about all those sort of mundane things, or those sort of basic menial things. So therefore, or let me just back up for a second. So when we are in that non-task oriented activity, again, waking up in the morning, tying our shoes, pouring breakfast, getting on the train, all that stuff, the energy of the brain goes into the default, right? Which is why they call it the default mode network. It's a network in the brain that's where we go when we're not paying attention to something. And that part of the brain is characterized by two very specific characterizations. Pardon me for my repetition. The first is that the default mode network is only interested in what is wrong, what's bad, what's scary out there. The other characteristic of the default mode network is it's always about ourselves. In other words, the default mode network wants us to think about what's wrong with us and with our life. okay? Which gets really complicated, right? Because then when we're thinking about what's wrong with work, we're thinking it's an inherently, self-identified, flaw in our very being, right? It's not just an email that has to be sent or something, right? It's big deal, okay? So I tell you that because I want you to know that it's not something that you're not broken, right? You're not flawed. You're not, and you're certainly not beyond repair. None of you, I guarantee you, no matter what levels of anxiety you have, you're not beyond repair. You're not beyond healing. Now, remember, the default mode network, which is the source of anxiety, right? And with people like us who are in anxiety, the only difference between us and like somebody who isn't in anxiety is that default mode network just became more robust, right? It just became overpowering, which is really just a process of integration in the brain. But again, I don't want to get too technical. Now, remember, the non-task oriented activity about this, that is the key. Because what's the opposite of non-task oriented activity? I mean, of course, the task oriented activity, but what does that mean, right? It means in the non-task oriented activity, what are we doing? We're not attending to that activity. We're not paying attention to tying our shoes or not paying attention to taking a shower. So while we're taking the shower and not paying attention to it, that's when we get into that default mode network that starts the process of the anxiety. Of course, it started before when we were in bed, but it continues, right? So the answer then becomes paying attention. When we train our attention on something, when we focus our attention on something, and yes, you can focus your attention on tying your shoes, you can focus your attention on driving your car, on taking a shower, on brushing your teeth. In fact, brushing your teeth is the very first practice I will teach you as a coach. To do it mindfully, to do it in a way that we use our attention. And the more we can do that, and that also just lying in bed, if you can, in that moment that you're waking up and in that pristine little tiny period of time in which there's no thoughts happening, if you can in that moment focus your attention on, like, even if you're just looking up at the ceiling and like seeing the designs on the stucco. I always see faces. Do you all see faces? Everywhere I look, I see, oh man, there's a little face. Oh, that guy looks like Jerry Garcia with the beard, That's a weird thing about me. But you could do something as simple as that. If I'm focused on the faces, guess what? My default mode network is not active. The part of my brain active while I'm looking at the faces on my ceiling is the part of my brain that is in control of everything. That is the thing that tells that other part of my brain everything is okay. We don't have to freak out. Now, of course, my silly thing about looking at the stucco, it doesn't have to be that. You could focus on the feeling of your breath. You could focus on the feeling of your body lying in the bed. You could close your eyes and just focus on what you can hear in that moment. Or you could do a mindfulness practice, which, could look as like a formal practice of just a very simple, attention training practice. Or it could look like something less formal, like, really paying attention to the steps that you're taking throughout your morning routine. Which means while you're in the shower, really be in the shower, right? Or the way that I teach the toothbrushing, right? Listen to the sound that your toothbrush is making. And every time your attention wanders away from that sound and you recognize that it's wandered, bring it back. And what happens then is just because here's the thing, when I say that the default mode network and people like us with anxiety is sort of overpowering and out of balance and like sort of supercharged, right? That happens very specifically because we've used it over and over and over and over. We've gotten into that space over and over and over and over. So it's like we've exercised that part of our brain. So in a very real way, we've created the Frankenstein monster in our brain. But the beautiful thing is that if we created it, we don't have to feel shame about this or even guilt. If we created it, we can uncreate it. Or we can create a different monster, right? Which is to say that every time you pay attention to anything in the world, anything at all, right? Whether it's the sound of your toothbrushing, whether it's the feeling of your steering wheel in your hand, whether it's the the feeling of your feet walking across the office, or the listening to the sounds of the fax machines and the people typing on their keyboards, and looking at the light coming in through the window, paying attention to that stuff. If you do that over and over and over, right, what happens is, or let me be more specific, when you train your attention on something, right? Let's say it's the sound of your toothbrush, right? Like as you're brushing your teeth, you're listening to the sound, you're paying attention to that sound. At some point, your attention's going to wander off, as I said a moment ago. And in that moment that we realize that the attention has wandered off, we just ease it back to that sound of the toothbrush, right? Every time that process happens, your attention wanders, you bring it back. It's like doing this at the gym, right? Or doing push-ups or doing pull-ups, right? That is the exercise of the brain. And the more you do that, the more the part of your brain, the very front part of your brain that's responsible for paying attention and the opposite of the default mode network, that part gets stronger and stronger and stronger. Now, it doesn't mean that the default mode network goes away. You still need that, right? There's a reason why it's there, right? We need to be aware of things that are, dangerous in our lives. It's not something we don't want. And that's the purpose of integration, right? Integration is not to diminish something, but rather to differentiate it and link it. So what we're not doing is we're not diminishing that power of our brain to have, foresight and prediction, right? And reflecting on all the stuff that might be wrong in our lives. That is a very positive thing to do. But what we're doing is we're balancing it with the part of our brain that can say, hey, it's not all that bad that we're all the stuff that we're thinking is not necessarily even true. And so if you can commit, science is very, very clear on this, okay? We're talking about literally between 10 and 15. The latest science says 12 minutes per day. And it doesn't even have to be all at the same time, right? You can do 3 minutes 4 times a day. But if you can commit to 12 to say 15 minutes per day, and only 5 days a week. Studies also show that people who take 2 days off per week tend to stick with the process a lot longer. And so if you can do this, if you can just take 10 to 15 minutes a day, after 2 months, your brain is already going to be in this state of integration, and you're already going to see immense differences. And then if you continue to do it, those differences and those changes become, I'm not going to say permanent because there's no such thing as permanence in the brain, but they become lasting. They become, really sustained, and they do feel permanent. And the beautiful thing is that you don't have to keep doing the practices. At a certain point, it almost becomes like a feedback loop, right? Like you do the practices, it becomes habitual. So you're doing it without even realizing you're doing it. Now, if you're interested in this, I can help. I can teach you how to do this. And yes, you could look it up in a book. You could Google it also, right? But a lot of people struggle with implementing it. And that's where a coach comes in. If a coach can stand there with you and help you and customize the practices and support you and hold you accountable and guide you through the process, you're talking about literally 6 months away from a completely different life. It's that quick. And again, a month before you start feeling something really significant. All right, folks, let me know what I can do for you. Let me know if you're interested in talking about this. Hit up the comments below, and I'll talk to you soon.